Yeah, we can start. Okay, so so welcome to this last session of the workshops on context-aware recommended systems. And it's a great pleasure, and I think it's honor for us to have here Professor Anind K. Anind is Professor and Dean of the Information School at the University of Washington. And for sure, Anind is very well known in our community for his early work on context and on the definition of context. And actually, I want to use, let's say, a couple of minutes to recall this definition that is in this paper, Understanding and Using Context. So an definition is context is any information that can be used to characterize the situation of an entity. An entity is a person, place, or object that is considered relevant to the interaction between a user and an application, including the user and the application themselves. So it's a very wide, let's say, perspective on context. And I think that this definition has motivated a lot of research on context, especially in the area of recommended system. Today, Anind will report on some of the research that he is doing in the last years, where he is focusing on collecting data from about people and how they interact with the devices in order to, let's say, understand the influence of context on their behavior and try to apply machine learning techniques in order to make predictions. So the title of Anind's talk is Using Everyday Routines as a Resource for Understanding Behaviors and Making Recommendations. So I'm really looking forward to listening to your presentation. Anind, the floor is yours. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you for the very kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here. I've known about and followed the work in the CARS workshop for many years, and I continue to follow it. In fact, I was looking at a paper by Moshe Unger just the other day, looking at some of your work, Moshe, in latent context-aware recommendation systems and seeing a really strong overlap with some of the things that we're trying to do. So I'm interested in us engaging in some of these conversations around this. So I want to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been doing, my research group has been doing for the last 5 years or so. And that is, it really stems around this idea of routines. So if we think of context as being, a description of a situation in a moment in time, we can think of routines as a collection of these moments in time strung together. So what you're seeing on the screen here is the routine of somebody who wakes up in the morning, and then a student that's going to school. And you can see that this routine has members, individual contextual moments. It has a sequence implying one thing follows the other, although it doesn't have to be a strict sequence. Each of the members have a particular duration of time. And then one of the interesting things is that just because someone has a routine doesn't mean they follow that routine all the time. They may deviate from that routine. That may be, today I woke up sick, so my routine is very different, and that would be an anomalous deviation. Or it could be, I live in Seattle, it rains quite often, and on a rainy day, my routine differs slightly in that I don't wait for the school bus outside, I wait for it under my awning at my house, and then I go outside. So that would be more of a regular deviation. And knowledge of these routines and deviations can actually be quite powerful when we're thinking about building autonomous systems. There was this first a website and then a book that was created called The Daily Routines of Famous Creative People. And what the author did was he went back and looked at old manuscripts and old journals from people from the arts and the sciences, from all walks of life, and tried to come up with what was a routine day for each of those individuals. And so you can see here in this sort of light blue and green is when they slept. Their creative work is in pink, this orange color, salmon color. Exercise is in this dark navy blue. Day jobs, not many of the people on the screen had a day job. Only a handful of them had things that they did during the day that was not part of their creative work. And then you can see sleep at the end. And so what this author did was say, okay, I'm taking all of the information I know about this individual, and I'm crafting this timeline of how they spent their day. And now with that information, you can start to do prediction or make recommendations to someone based on what you understand about their routines. In a similar kind of way, we should be able to do that in today's world, but without having to rely on those journals or those manuscripts to provide us this kind of information. Think about all the objects that you might interact with on a daily basis. So in order to figure out what are all the objects that you touch and what all the things that you interact with to sort of build up this routine over time, this is fundamentally a multimodal AI problem. You need to be able to sense, you need some intelligence, you need to be able to communicate. And so some of the work we've been looking at is what are those novel data science and machine learning techniques that we can use to extract routines from these large corpus of data and to be able to extract routines and deviations. This was another book project called A Day in the Life, and it was a picture book. It started as a photo exhibit and then became a book. And this took pictures of, the artist had individuals take pictures of all the objects they touched in a single day. So this one, I don't know if you can read it down at the bottom, it says, A Day in the Life of Lawrence Spencer King, artist and meditation teacher from Los Angeles. And the book is called Everything We Touch. And so you can see here a lot of clothes, some food, more clothes. The interesting thing is the only computational things on this, in what this woman touched each day, was her mobile phone in the top right and her laptop here. And otherwise, everything else would have to be sensed in some other mechanism than what we traditionally think of, like some kind of instrumentation. Take another example. This is a chef from Marrakesh, and not surprising, most of his objects that he touches every day are related to food. But you can see his Mac in the bottom right and his mobile phone in the top left. And there is an electronic toothbrush or electric toothbrush up here. But for the most part, most of the things he's interacting with are analog devices that don't have sensing or computation built into them. So coming up with people's routines, much in the same way of sensing context, is a real challenge, and often we have to use proxies for those sensing. So why are routines important? Well, we develop routines to reduce our cognitive effort, right? I don't have to think about my morning routine because I've kind of offloaded it to it. I kind of can enact it without having to think a lot about it. I'm able to, I know what time I have to wake up my kids. I know what time I have to leave to go drive my son to school. All of these are sort of built in to the point where I don't have to think about it, except in the case of a deviation. When there is a deviation, whether that's a regular deviation or anomaly, that's a place where there's often stress or extra effort has to be exerted because I can't just rely on this sort of background process. And I will argue that routines are at least as actionable as sort of low-level context inferred activities. Routines are really being untapped as a resource for both from a sensing perspective and from an application perspective. They really, I think routines can provide a novel way of trying to understand human intent, which I'll argue is sort of the basis or the reason we want to have context awareness. Routines are longer term, which is kind of interesting because people develop routines over a period of time, so they're more built into our lives. They do highlight opportunities for change. If I can see that I'm tired all the time, if I look at models of how I'm sleeping over time, I can see that I identify places where I might actually be able to get more sleep. So they do provide opportunities for change. However, at the same time, they provide barriers for change because something that's built in or something that's a routine over time, it might be harder to change, in fact, are harder to change. So we are working on software to try and address all of these things. And really, the opportunity to study routines and make interventions and I'll argue that interventions are in the health domain, which is mainly where I work, interventions are really a form of recommendation system. What is the thing that you're asking someone to change or do so that they can improve some behavior about themselves? So let me get a little bit concrete and talk to you about one of the projects one of my former PhD students worked on, Matthew Lee. He's now a researcher at the Toyota Technical Institute, Toyota Research Institute, sorry. So he built a system called DwellSense, which was really looking at the activities of daily living for elderly individuals. And so these activities that we try to monitor, so to understand whether an elderly individual should be able to live independently, taking medicine, doing laundry, keeping up with news, balancing finances, making meals, communicating on the phone. These are all things that we look at to see if someone can continue to remain independent. Matt built a series of technologies, very simple technology. So here's a very cheap pillbox that he instrumented, you can see. And this pillbox can tell which day of the week you opened. It can tell whether you've turned the pillbox upside down, whether you've taken pills out. So it gives you information, some rich information about someone's interaction with the pillbox. With the telephone, he was studying how many times someone made a call before they actually made the correct call. So you may dial the first 3 digits and then hang up because you dialed it wrong. You may dial the whole number and realize you called the wrong number. So these are all signs of cognitive activity, cognitive success. And then here's an instrumented coffee maker. It's not the prettiest thing with sensors and wires hanging off of it, but he instrumented it to sort of follow the coffee making process, from adding the water to the filter to the coffee grounds to pulling out the pitcher and pouring the coffee. So with this instrumentation, you can watch how people are performing these fairly simple activities of daily living. This is an example deployment. You can see our laptop that's collecting all the information is behind this woman's TV, the pillboxes here on her table, and it's just a typical living room in one of the apartments that this was deployed in. In each apartment, in addition to the technology, we deployed a tablet that had a very simple display. It just showed you how you behaved on the previous day. So today is Saturday, and this would show the data for Friday. So here you can see that the person took their morning medicine on time, but they opened the Sunday and Monday days before they correctly opened the Tuesday slot. In the afternoon, they actually missed their afternoon medicine. And then it gives them a score on how well they did from a timeliness perspective and a correctness perspective. For phone call making, they made 8 calls, 2 of which were missed dials. And it again gives them an indication of how well they did. And then for the coffee making task, it showed that they successfully completed the task, but they repeated one of the tasks twice. So it provides a little bit of feedback, again, not real-time feedback, but feedback about the previous day about how well you completed these different tasks. So what impact does this have? So what we can see here is, and let's just focus on the top graph. You can see here that if you think of this as midnight and then down here as midnight again, each column is considered as a day. And so this is the beginning of the day, this is the end of the day. And so this collection of data up here, these dots up here, indicate the morning time when people took their morning medication. And this time here indicates when they took the evening medication. So you can see for this individual, sent through Matt's pillbox, that for the most part, they're taking medicine over a period of 2 or 3 hours each day. But for the most part, they're taking their medicine on time. There's a few days when they actually miss their medicine. And then there's several days where they actually took the medicine late. In the evening, this person did much better, where they're basically taking all their medicine on time within a very tight window, with only maybe a single mistake here where they took their pill late. This is a second patient. They only had morning medicine, and you can see that they also made several mistakes in taking their pills late and making a mistake with their pills. So these displays or this visualization that we're seeing so far was taken only with the data collected by the sensor, without having the display in people's apartments. Once the displays were added to the apartments, you can see how clean the signals become. For both, in this case, this person didn't have to clean up their evening signal that much, and they still made a couple of mistakes, but you can see how much better they performed in the morning medicine. And for this individual, you're still seeing lots of cases where they took their pill late for them, but that for the most part, their signal was cleaned up quite significantly, and that this intervention, having the display about what happened the previous day, did as an intervention for how they took their medicine. So it really did improve their medication adherence for these 2 participants. And across the board, we saw for all of our participants an increase in adherence, a reduction in the variance, an improvement in the timeliness, what time when they took their medicine. And we saw similar improvements if you look at the coffee maker and the phone call making tasks as well. So here's just a very simple example of how routines can be leveraged. And it turns out that if you study these routines you'll find that there's a very strong correlation to how routine people's behaviors are and how well they perform on a cognitive test that's commonly given to elders called the mini mental state examination, to the point where studying people's routines can actually replace needing to do this evaluation, because the routines have such a strong signal on them about someone's cognitive state. So this allows you to do automated, cheap, and repeated assessments without requiring an occupational therapist or physical therapist to come in and perform these kinds of tasks. So I want to point out one more concrete example that occurred during our study that might indicate the value of routines. So here we have an individual who started in our study in August, and you can see they were doing okay. They were mostly taking their medicine correctly, and we're not seeing any mistakes other than in terms of forgetting to take their pills. But several times they started taking their pills late in the morning, and you're seeing mistakes in the evening as well. So the patient's doing well from August to November. In January, the patient had a bad fall, was hospitalized, and died in the hospital. And what we can see in November to January is lots of mistakes happening in the pill taking. Now, we were not monitoring this data in real time. And in fact, when the patient went to go see the doctor in December, and the doctor said, "How is everything going? Are you taking your medicine?" And the patient assured the doctor, "Yes, I'm doing fine. I'm taking my medicine, no problems." But we can actually see here is lots of mistakes in the medicine taking behavior. So if we were to run an anomaly detection system, you would probably see in December, an anomaly would be indicated, and an intervention could have been taken at that point in time were the data being looked at in real time. So not saying that being able to detect this and intervene would necessarily have saved this person's life, but the potential certainly is there. So like many of you, we leverage the mobile phone to do our multimodal sensing for all the obvious reasons, full of sensors. Lots of people carry them, just a very handy device to be able to use. So what can we do with such smart devices? So I gave the example of the medicine taking, and now I want to talk a little bit about another sort of simple example of being able to leverage the mobile phone to detect routines, but this time around driving. So these are, I used to work at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for many years. And these are two places in Pittsburgh. And if I were to optimize for travel time, so I wanted the shortest travel time, this is the route that I would be given. And instead, if I wanted to optimize for shortest distance, this is the route I would be given. And not surprisingly, if I change my optimization function, I get a different route. But there's lots of things we care about. We care about how much it costs. So there was a study done several years ago that said if costs of tolls doubled, 73% of the driving population would avoid taking those toll roads. So we're pretty cost sensitive. We're also sensitive in how willing we are to deal with different kinds of congestion. Some people will leave hours early to avoid congestion. You have to have routes that actually match a driver's skills. And what you understand is that there are a lot of different factors that go into determining what my driving routine is. And while I'm not going to argue that my driving routine is as unique as a fingerprint, we can kind of think of each person's routine, whatever the domain is, in this case driving, can be seen as a bit of a fingerprint. So if we think about route recommendation, everybody knows that you can use an algorithm like A-star, Dijkstra's algorithm, and you can find out the shortest path from start to goal just by traversing the network. Instead, if we look at what path somebody took, we have features of the road network, could we instead find the behavior or routine that explains why they took a particular path? So rather than just taking the shortest path, I may take a slightly different path along the top or along the bottom. And by observing how people drive over time, are we able to understand their preferences for each different features? And those features might be the speed limit on a road. It might be the amount of congestion. It could be weather that day. It could be all sorts of things that impact the road network. And so we can take an algorithm that basically looks at what is my current state, what is an action that someone took that took me to a next state, and you can build a network of these state action pairs over time by looking at these large behavioral models or collections of data about people's routines. So just as a quick example, you can see someone's in a state, they're approaching a particular, this is very simple, they're approaching an intersection. The action is that they brake hard because somebody's in front of them. Then they enter the intersection, they start a little bit of gas, they start to exit the intersection, and then they push harder on the gas to exit the intersection. So that's a fairly simple one where someone's just sort of moving straight through an intersection. And so what can we do with this kind of routines, and where's the value for recommendation systems? Well, if we can build information that learns our preferences for driving from repeated surveying of someone's driving just from their mobile phone, well, you can start to do personalized route recommendation. So I know that I like to drive on roads that have high speed limits, but has a lot of traffic. I don't mind the stop and go, right? Versus my wife prefers to drive on roads that have slow speed limits and less traffic because she doesn't like the stop and go. So even though we might be going to the same place in separate cars, we would get routes that actually match the way we like to drive. Similarly, we could do vehicle prediction. We built a system based on understanding people's routines that can actually automatically turn someone's blinker on to indicate that they're going to take a left or right-hand turn in advance, because that's actually the not using one's blinker actually leads to a lot of accidents. So there's a bunch of different things that with knowledge of how someone performs a particular routine, in this case driving, that you could build, and there's others on the screen that I won't have the time to go into, but that are applications where recommendations could be made, whether it's an individual route, whether it's a change in route because there's a hazard coming out, whether it's a recommendation to take care of something on my task list because it knows that I'm going to be taking a particular route to go in a particular direction. Similarly, this can be applied to solving a safety issue rather than a convenience issue. So if we look at the number of people that are impacted by unsafe driving, really due to aggressive driving or novice drivers, we can see a lot of fatal accidents and a large cost, financial cost of being aggressive, being what we call road rage. And so, as I've said, these driving routines are unique, but can we use these driving routines now to determine aggressiveness? And it turns out, with about 90% accuracy, we can determine whether an individual driver is an aggressive driver, whether the route that they're on right now is an aggressive path that they took, or whether this particular maneuver that they took in this one intersection would be considered aggressive. And so we've been working on interventions that we could show to individuals to help them at least demonstrate how they might be less aggressive. So what you're going to see here is how an aggressive driver moves through an intersection, and then overlaid on top of that, you can see how a non-aggressive driver would have done that same thing. So let me just pause that for a second. Pause that. So what you'll see first is how an aggressive driver is just sped through the intersection. And then on the second pass through, you'll see what the aggressive driver is showed in gray, and the non-aggressive driver, a simulated non-aggressive driver, is showed in white, and highlight the difference. So here's the aggressive driver. And now the non-aggressive driver is shown in white to highlight the difference of how a non-aggressive driver would have driven in the same situation. Second example, someone is trying to take a left turn through an intersection. And so you can see non-aggressive driver slammed on the brake, and then they accelerate through the intersection. And a non-aggressive driver, a simulated non-aggressive driver, would have had a smooth path through the entire intersection. So these were just very simple interventions to try and convey the behaviors that aggressive drivers were exhibiting. We had to play a lot with when was the right time to show them. We did the obvious dumb thing, which was to show them their aggressive driver right after they performed an aggressive maneuver. And that just made them more aggressive. So that was clearly a bad idea. But we found that waiting too long, say at the end of a week, was too long from the actual incident to impact change. So where the sweet spot we found was to show them these recommendations or interventions at the end of the day or at the end of a drive. So, and that had more impact on them recognizing that they were driving aggressively, and actually for a short time at least, reduce their aggressiveness in their driving. going to talk about one more example as I move into my last couple of examples here. This one is in the case of hospital readmissions, and in here we're looking at people with using mobile phones and a wearable device, a simple Fitbit or Apple Watch that collects information about sleep and steps. And I was working with a collaborator who was very interested in studying whether we could leverage this kind of routine information for people who are recovering from surgery. So you can see here on the screen that 13 to 37%, so about 1/10 to 1/3 of surgery patients are readmitted within 30 days of discharge. And in the United States, the way that the medical reimbursement system works from the federal government, if anyone is readmitted within 30 days of being discharged from the hospital, the hospital system makes less money on those patients. So they have every reason to try and stop patients from being readmitted at all, because that's a burden to the healthcare system, but really to stop them from being readmitted within these initial 30 days after being discharged. And you can see here that readmissions cost the health system $26 billion, of which 17 billion of that was considered to be preventable, which means that if we could detect someone who is more at risk for being readmitted, then there might be interventions that we can put into place, recommendations that we can put into place while they're still in the hospital, before discharging them, to reduce the likelihood of being discharged. And so we were working with an oncology population, a cancer population. And so this was a population that was going to come in to get surgery, a scheduled surgery. Before the surgery, for a month, they wore a Fitbit, they had our instrumented smartphones, and we gave them the software and the Fitbit device a month before at their pre-operation appointment with their surgeon. Then they came in for surgery a month later, and they were in the hospital, and we collected information basically from the time they went to the recovery room after surgery all the way to discharge, and then we followed them 60 days after discharge. All the way through, we also had access to their electronic health records. So we had fairly detailed information about what was happening. And it turns out that using routines, we could predict with about 85% accuracy, so not good enough to be able to use in practice, but certainly better than many of the state-of-the-art approaches. We could predict which patients were going to be readmitted. And in here, what was really the case was how much were the patients able to move. So the Fitbit was the most valuable feature, the most valuable sensing. We were looking at how much patients were able to move, or the key feature I would say in our model was how much patients were able to move and how frequently. It wasn't that someone was able to get up and take 2,000 steps in one go, but it was how frequently were they getting up to move, because this was a sign of, or a proxy for pain. If the patient was in too much pain, they wouldn't have been able to get out of bed, and they would have these long sedentary bouts. So in fact, if you start counting up the length and duration, the duration and frequency of the sedentary bouts, that is a very strong indicator of whether someone's going to be need to be readmitted within that 30-day period. So the last set of projects that I want to talk to you about, and these are the ones that I've been spending much of my last couple of years focused on, is around student health. I have a number of collaborators who have been interested in student health, particularly as it relates to substance abuse. So in this case, we're looking at binge drinking. So I had a colleague when I was at Carnegie Mellon, he was at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's an expert in interventions, text messaging interventions for people who binge drink. So a binge drinker is not someone who's an alcoholic, someone who has an addiction to alcohol, but is usually of a particular age, an adolescent to young adult, who will binge drink to excess, mainly for social reasons and not for addiction reasons. Unfortunately, binge drinking leads to a lot of hazardous issues. There's high rates of alcohol-related problems, a number of comorbidities that result. And the interventions have not really changed how people behave in choosing to drink or not. So his typical approach would be that he would send a text message on a Friday and a Saturday night and giving a bunch of reasons why they shouldn't go out and binge drink. And while that has some effect, it doesn't have enough of an effect to really engage with them about their binge drinking behavior. So he said, with your analysis and routines, do you think you can detect or predict when someone's going to binge drink? I'd like to be able to get them at the moment in time when they're going to binge drink, so I can have my interventions more temporally co-located with the action they're going to take, right? Intervene at the point of decision making. And so I went away, talked to my team, and we're pretty sure we could not make any impact on this problem, because how would we, we didn't really see a sign or a signal. We didn't think with our, with our smartphones or wearable devices that we'd be able to detect a decision point where someone was going to choose to binge drink. So we said, let's instead see if we can detect when somebody is binge drinking. If we can detect that moment, then maybe that there are other interventions that could be made that might be useful, not as useful as predicting in advance, but still might be something that's useful. So we collected data from 38 people, and what you can see here on each individual is a vertical bar. You can see the number of incidences of non-drinking episodes that they reported. In blue, you can see the number of incidents of drinking episodes, and then in orange, you can see the number of incidences of heavy drinking episodes. And some of our participants didn't report very many episodes. Some of them reported a lot, with very few, most of them being non-drinking episodes. But we did get a lot of, you can see in the orange, we did get a fair number of drinking episodes and heavy drinking episodes or binge drinking episodes that we were able to collect. And I should define binge drinking or heavy drinking. It depends on body mass index, so it really just depends on what state your body is in. But for the average female, it is 4 or more drinks in a period of 2 hours. And for the average male, it's 5 or more drinks in a period of 2 hours. So fair number of drinks in a fairly short period of time. And you can see, if we looked at day of the week, how the drinking episodes are distributed, and you can see mostly the heavy drinking episodes are happening on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So those are what we characterize as the weekend. And in terms of when they occur during the day, you can see that they sort of start around 6 p.m. and they continue to maybe around 3 o'clock in the morning. And that there's not a lot of heavy drinking or binge or drinking at all during the actual daytime. So if we built a model that was just based on day of week and time of day, we could already do quite well, but that's what the text message intervention was already doing, and it only had limited effect. So we built a model that took into account a lot of different sensing, and I'll go into a little bit of detail. I have a few minutes left. I'll go into a little bit of detail on some of the features that were relevant to building an accurate model. But you can see here that we built a model that was so this is a confusion matrix, was very accurate at detecting the non-drinking events, almost 98, a little over 98% accurate. And it was fairly accurate at detecting the binge drinking events, 91%. But where it made most of its mistakes was in detecting the light drinking episodes. So it confused those not for heavy drinking, but it confused those for not drinking episodes. And we're not still trying to understand why. When the heavy drinking, when the classifier made mistakes on heavy drinking, it misclassified those as non-drinking as well. So there's a bias towards, and not surprising in the data we see that, there's a bias towards non-drinking. But overall, you get about 95% accuracy. And if instead you just went with a time of day or day of week, or you picked the most likely class, you're looking at about an 82% accuracy. So fairly sophisticated, fairly accurate in terms of being able to detect drinking episodes, in particular heavy drinking episodes. And some of the features are going to be obvious. They were using data from the accelerometer, which was sort of tracking how people were walking across the floor. Some of them were non-obvious, like someone's use of emojis. We didn't look at the content of what people were texting or typing, but we did look at whether something was emoji or not, and we looked at frequency of mistakes that people were making. How often did the autocorrect kick in when they were using the keyboard? And we saw that their use of emojis shifted dramatically as they went from a non-drinking state to a drinking state to a heavy drinking state. So there are signals in what people are doing that can at least help you detect in real time what state someone is in from a drinking perspective. Our newer work is actually starting to look at, can we predict binge drinking episodes in advance? And it turns out with a window of about 6 hours of data, we can predict about an hour, it's only an hour ahead of time, but we can predict 1 hour ahead of time with about 85% accuracy that a college student is going to binge drink. So this is really exciting because then an hour ahead of time, hopefully before they've made a decision that they're going to engage in this heavy drinking behavior, interventions can now be applied, or recommendations can start to be made that would actually significantly alter someone's behavior. So right now, this work is being integrated into a 5,000 person intervention trial or recommendation trial. And we've extended the work to start looking at, we've started collecting some data with individuals who are under the effect of marijuana, and we're starting to look at individuals who are under the effect of opioids, and looking in particular at when they might have cravings and might have a relapse for somebody who's trying to reduce their use of opioids. The very last part of this work with college students and substance abuse led to some other work that we are doing, looking at mental health in general of college students. And here in the United States, many college students feel overwhelmed, many feel exhausted. 1/3 of college students feel too depressed to function, and 1/16 of them have seriously considered suicide. And so there is a real mental health crisis amongst a college age population. It doesn't have to just be college students, although this happens to be the population we're focused on, but that age group in general, college student age group, there is a mental health crisis going on in the United States and in many developed countries. For college students, this can result in lower academic performance. It increases the likelihood that they will not complete their degree, and certainly increases the risk for suicide. And so we've been looking at, can we study things like how lonely someone is, how depressed they are, what's their quality of sleep, by looking at these routines over time. And I won't go into the details too much, but we're about 88% accurate at detecting depression, that a college student is depressed, from only a couple of weeks of data at the beginning of an academic term. And we can detect or predict depression in advance, what their depression scores will be at the end of that college term, or even at midterm time when stresses increase. So we're about 88% accurate at detecting depression, about 75% accurate at predicting it ahead of time. So these are really promising. And I'm going to skip past some of this work here, but I want to say that I've been incredibly influenced by the work that's come out of the context-aware recommendation system, looking at what we call contextually filtered features, but are really a set of features. Sorry, there's a car alarm going off. Really a set of features that we were inspired by work in context-aware recommendation systems, looking at instead of looking at a single feature. So instead of just looking at location, instead of just looking at when people were physically active throughout the day, and looking at their location throughout the entire day, we instead pair those together by saying, let's look at physical activity, but only when they're off campus. So by pairing a piece of context within another context, we've developed this idea that we call contextually filtered features that enables us to hone in more closely on features that have higher degrees of signal. And those have allowed us to build these much more accurate systems that we're seeing here. So I'm just going to skip past some of this in the interest of time. And you can see that by using these contextually filtered features, we can get much higher rates of recognition accuracy. So in this talk, I've described that my goal is to really understand and extract this notion of routine, because I believe routines are a better way to identify what someone's intent is than individual pieces of context. We're working on a mathematical model of what it means to be routine, and trying to assess, is somebody more routine or less routine than another individual? How much entropy is there in their data, in their model that we produce for them? And trying to understand what impact, whether there's a sweet spot for an individual, and how much entropy there should be in their model in order to identify what kinds of recommendations or interventions could be done. We're going to be continuing to focus on mental health and substance abuse and looking to support different kinds of interventions and recommendations. And in my ideal world, I've been thinking about, could I eventually build an interactive decision support system that would allow anybody, in this case a college student, to indicate some desired outcome. I want to maintain my physical fitness and I want to get good grades. And then but I'm in this situation where I can do either A or B. Which one would actually help me achieve my outcome? As a way of supporting individuals' decisions in making those, in deciding what to do. So to conclude, I think that there's an opportunity to really innovate by using everyday objects as a resource for design and for extracting these routines. Objects need sensing, intelligence, and communication. There are certainly challenges in determining what to sense. This is true for any kind of context awareness. There's challenges in achieving good data sets because these are often large, very noisy data sets in order to collect large data sets about routines. We are still working on challenges in developing new algorithms and for both machine learning and data science. And then we have challenges in identifying what actions to take. And really those are the recommendations: when to intervene, how to intervene, and what intervention. So these are all challenges that you're all familiar with in your work in context-aware recommendation systems. And then our goal, of course, is to produce systems that can have societal impact, which is why we're mostly focusing on applications in the health domain. So I encourage you all to think about all the objects that you interact with on a daily basis and what that may indicate to an oracle or an observer, and what your routine is for the day. And what you would do if you had access to the routine information about you. So I will end with that, and thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Anind. And now it's time for questions. Oh, Daniel Jones now is only clapping. Alex, please go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the nice talk, Anind. In your binge drinking example, you referred to sensors and some other contextual information, but you went a little bit quickly over it. And the question is, in your model, like predicting binge drinking, can you talk a little bit more about how important was contextual information and how you represented and how you modeled this contextual information for the binge drinking application? So
yes, so the sensors we used for that project were multifold. For ground truth, we initially used what's called a scram bracelet, which is a bracelet, an ankle bracelet that you put on someone's leg that can detect whether they have consumed alcohol or not. You'll often find them used by people who have been incarcerated, who have to go to jail, or on some kind of probation for alcohol use. Not surprisingly, many of our students did not want to wear that because it's quite intrusive, it's embarrassing, you can't go through security, right? So instead we relied on ground truth, but some of our subjects still wore the scram bracelet. And then all of the rest of the sensing, all the rest of the context came from people's mobile phones. So we were tracking location, we were tracking movement, we were tracking activity, we were tracking what applications they used, communications they made through either phone calls or text. We didn't have access to anything else. We had information about what they typed. So that was the set of information that we had access to. But the features that were the most useful were accelerometer, so how they were moving through space, location to a limited degree, because a lot of the times the binge drinking happened in their own residences. And so it's very hard to use that as a feature when, that's a place where they sleep and they study and they do all those other things. And then how they interacted, how they communicated with other people was important. And that typing behavior, the number of mistakes they made, the number of emojis that they used were also really strong indicators. This was put into a fairly simplistic algorithm. It was just a simple decision tree, a random forest. With the outcomes being one of our three classes: not drinking, light drinking, and heavy drinking. And you can see the results that I showed with about 90% accuracy at being able to detect these different kinds of behaviors.
yeah, thank you.
Bamshad? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting. So this is maybe more of a comment than question, but I'm interested in your reaction. There's been a lot of work in context-aware recommendation and the idea of context adaptation. So the idea that users may move from one context to another context. You kind of mentioned that at the beginning in terms of your description of what you call a routine. And much of that work has actually been the idea of being able to adapt to a new context. So the recommender system would have to very quickly adapt when the user changes context. Let's say if you're listening to music, you change from, let's say, exercising to, let's say, having dinner or something like that, right? To some extent, it seems like your notion of intervention or recommendation is sort of the opposite of that. So recognizing the changing context, but then trying to bring the user back to the original context rather than trying to adapt to the new context. And I was just wondering if you think that's accurate and if there is some of that work from context adaptation that might transfer over to this work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at it. I hadn't thought about it, but as you described it, it absolutely makes complete sense. The challenge that we have, so yes, we are trying to keep someone in a particular context or routine. In the case of the driving or the health behaviors, it's to keep them in a healthier state. In other cases, it's to make the deviation from the routine much less, so that it's much less of a cognitive burden. One of the challenges, and one of the places I think we can leverage much more of the work that you refer to, the context adaptation, is that we know that people's, I guess there's two things. There's, if we think about the initial slide I showed, which had these, this cartoon sketch of somebody going through their morning, each one of those was essentially a new context, someone going, performing a different set of activities throughout the day. While I think of those as individual contexts and that sequence as a routine, we could be thinking about, well, how should the system change as you move between those? And that's something I haven't really thought about. The part that we have thought about is, if you think that over a longer period of time, people's routines or context changes. So my routines may change seasonally, or it may change as my kids, graduate and leave the house and go off to college. And how quickly can we detect those larger changes in routines so that we can essentially learn when the model figure out when the model needs to learn and adapt. But those are over much longer periods of time, and that's where we put a lot of our focus on. But I am very intrigued by the framing that you just gave, and I'm certainly going to look at that. Thank you.
We have another question from Christine, please.
Hi, Anand.
Hi, Christine. It's good to see you too.
My question somehow relates to what Bamsha said before, but giving a different twist. So I was wondering, in context-aware recommender systems, we frequently look on different people, different persons, we personalize, and then, okay, it's me, but I'm in a different context. So like music, okay, I'm doing exercise. So within my space of what I like, it will adapt to the context. And I'm asking whether in the work that you are doing, it's maybe other way around sometimes, that how much of the context is person related or not. So for instance, if it's raining outside, does it really matter to know what person it is? Then I'm waiting when there's a roof above my head.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think with a lot of, I would say, and this is a very large generalization, but for most of the work that we've been doing, particularly in the health domain, it is very much specifics about the individual and less about the environmental context. The one exception might be driving. So while there are specifics I have about the way I drive, weather outside, particularly if it's extreme weather, like a bad snowstorm in Pittsburgh, let's say, or it makes a big difference in how people drive or their preferences, how their preferences are exhibited in the way that they drive. But I would say, to reiterate, for most of our work, and I'm trying to think if I can explain the reason why. In the readmissions work, people are in the hospital. So there's, the location, the weather, none of that really matters. It's how they're behaving in the hospital. So that one makes sense. For the drinking behavior, that one's a little harder to explain because we think of environments where the weather is really extreme as being populations where alcohol is used a lot more. So you would think that it would have an impact, but maybe because we're not studying it across these large extremes, we're only studying it in a particular city, we're not able to see the value of that, of those things. So maybe the short answer, the long answer is, if we were to do some of these studies over a much wider variety of environments, we might see a larger impact of these environmental contexts as opposed to the personalized context, but that's total speculation.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, good to see you.
Any other questions? Maybe I can make the last question before we go to the final discussion. Anind, what you have described, let's say, I'm trying to put this into the context of recommended system, and in particular on the let's say session-based recommenders. So these routines that you are describing are typically, let's imagine that we have seen Spotify, how people are consuming music. No?
Right.
So one track after the other. No, what we do in recommended system is typically make predictions about what will be the next, no? And then recommendations are actually built around this prediction. I think this is totally wrong. And I think that also the presentation by Spotify today was indicating that we have to give a better recommendation. No? So this is just the detection of the behavior. And what you have shown is that the detection of the behavior is not immediately building the recommendation. The recommendation should come on top of that in order maybe to change the behavior, to maintain a stability, or to optimize some other criteria. Do you share with me this idea? Because also this, I think it's very important for recommended system. We should stop recommending the things that people are doing or the tracks that the people are listening. We should understand what is important, what is useful, what brings value in a recommendation, even deviating then from the routine in some cases.
I love that. I love that framing. I would love to see my work even move into that direction. That's a really nice way of putting it.
Okay, thank you. Good. If there are no more questions, I think that we can close with clapping.
Yeah, thank you
for the presentation and for the talk and for the QA session.